Hi, welcome to the Product Momentum Podcast, a podcast about how to use technology to solve challenging technology problems for your organization.
All right, so new episode because it's a new month. And today we've got Dan Olsen. And Dan's someone that I've been following for several years in the product management space. And what I love about Dan is we can kind of go anywhere. And me and him were chatting one night, and I was just pinging him with questions about, what do you think about Scrum? What do you think about this with Agile? What do you think about backlogs? What do you think about user testing? He could go anywhere. He had answers for everything. He had opinions, and it was awesome. So we are super excited to talk to him today.
He's been doing it for so long. I mean, he's worked at Intuit. He's written the book. The Mind the Product folks call him the lean, mean product machine. I mean, this man is accomplished in our world, right?
Yeah, he's done a lot of talks, a lot of speaking, and a lot of training and consulting. So he gets to see how tons of different businesses are building products, what they're doing right, where they can improve. And so today we're going to specifically talk about building a first version of a product, MVP. How do you test it effectively and efficiently without going so deep with, an investment? Like, how do you get the most for your money and your time?
Yeah, and I can't wait to ask him about nuclear submarines.
It's pronounced nuclear, actually.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks for correcting me.
Okay. So hope everyone enjoys this interview with Dan Olsen.
Let's get after it.
Well, Sean, today we have a good friend of ours, Dan Olsen, and we've been coming to know Dan through his work and meeting him and understanding what he does to work with companies and product teams and help them build better products. And so Dan Olsen, hello, how are you?
I'm great, Joe, and Sean. It's great to be here with you all today.
Excellent. So would you mind introducing yourself and just telling us a little bit about what you do, what's your role, what are you doing with people in this world?
Yeah, no, I do several things. So all of them, though, relate to product management and building great products. So what I largely do these days is speak at conferences and events. It was a pleasure to speak at your Product Momentum event. That was a lot of fun. And more generally, just provide training. So I do a lot of public and private training workshops to train product teams on kind of modern practices on product management and product development. I also coach product leaders and teams, and I still do some hands-on consulting, which is a lot of fun, applying some of the concepts we're going to be talking about today, like actually defining MVPs, actually doing the wireframes myself, writing the screeners and interviewing users. And I also wrote the book, The Lean Product Playbook, which kind of captures a lot of the advice and my perspective on how I think about building great products. So, and in addition to that, I run a meetup. I live in Silicon Valley, and I just love bringing together thought leaders and having a community of people here. So for 5 years now, I've been hosting a monthly speaker series called Lean Product. And I think that's most of what I do.
That's all?
Yeah. Well, also, actually, there's one more thing. Once a year, I help co-organize a Product Leader Summit, which is coming up on the 19th of September.
Uh-huh.
All right.
How long have you been doing that?
This is our 4th Product Leader Summit.
Fantastic.
So it's a lot of fun. Yeah. Luckily, we have a team of people because it's a lot of work, as you know, to put on an event.
As we know.
But yeah.
Cool. Good luck with that.
So when we had dinner a few weeks back, I remember you telling me that you worked in submarine design for the Navy. So first of all, publicly, thank you for your service.
Yeah, thanks.
That's a big deal. But I'm interested to start off our conversation with this question. How do you equate that experience to the development of software products?
Yeah, it's funny because we talked about it, and it was the coolest job right out of college. So I was an electrical engineering major. I was Navy ROTC, so they had paid for my scholarship. So I had to find, the right part of the Navy that I thought was going to be the best. I interviewed at Naval Reactors and was lucky to get there. So I basically, the way I describe it is like NASA for submarines. And so my title was technically like engineer and then lead engineer. So it was a very technical job. They sent us to 6 months of training in like nuclear and mechanical engineering, and you had to have a tech background, all this stuff. Then when my 5 years were up, I went to business school. That's what brought me to Silicon Valley. And that's where I learned about product management. And I was like, oh, that's what I want to do. You get to like work on product, but not actually build it, interface with customers, think about the business. And then when I was lucky to get my first product management job at Intuit, that's when as I started doing the job, I'm like, oh, this isn't too different from what I was doing on the submarines, which the commonalities I think are, one, we're working on a complex product. Submarine's a complex product. The Quicken, application that I was working on had been around for a long time, had tons of functionality, was relatively complex. Maybe not quite as complex as a submarine, but still very complex. And because of that complexity, it requires, a large group of cross-functional skills to build and execute that product, just like we did at Naval Reactors. And so at Naval Reactors, we divided up the responsibilities along certain lines, and you would basically have to get alignment or agreement. We actually called it concurrence on anything you recommended. So if there was a certain system in the submarine that I said, yep, this looks like a good design, I'd have to go get official sign-off from these other people. So I was totally used to this idea of, hey, we're developing this product in a cross-functional team manner, and we've got to get buy-in from everybody and sign off that these requirements are good and this design meets the requirements. So obviously it wasn't software and it wasn't in the commercial sector, but those aspects of kind of building a complex product cross-functionally were very, very similar. And so it felt very natural to me, even though the domain was different.
Very cool. It's a great little segue there. So we always have a focus for every episode. And what we want to talk about with you was kind of like user testing, user research, and specifically, how can you do as much of that as possible potentially before you build anything, building a new product, or maybe doing as much as you can as you build a very small or minimum viable product, as they say, type of product. So can you just maybe tell us a little bit about your philosophy with all of that and maybe set that up for the rest of the conversation?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, whenever you're building a product, you either explicitly or implicitly are making tons of assumptions and hypotheses. And there's just a million different decisions that you have to make, whether you realize it or not. And so if you just rush in and build a product, there's a lot of uncertainty and risk in all those assumptions. And the probability that you got all of those like just perfect when you build it is just super, super low, right? If you take two scenarios. Scenario one, we envision a product, we build it, we launch it, and then we realize all the things that we didn't get right, versus scenario two, where we envision the product, we come up with a prototype, we test it, we figure out what's not right, we fix those things, then we build it and launch it. Obviously, the second way is a lot smarter. It's less risky. It's higher ROI. The one thing that comes up is, but it's not as fast because you've got to test. But I would argue in the grand scheme of things, it's actually faster because building is expensive, it's slower, and it's harder to change. It's funny because a lot of my larger clients, tech debt is a big thing that comes up. Tech debt starts accruing the second you write your first line of code, that silent tech debt is building up and you don't realize you're locking yourself in with certain things, right? And the way that plays out is if you build it and then you slowly realize, wow, we didn't get the signups we want. Maybe we should go talk to, you start to realize, wow, this isn't quite right. And then you go to the engineering team to change stuff. Then they're like, well, we've already built the database this way. We've got these API calls this way. It's just a lot harder to change, right? So I just think that's my general idea is to articulate your hypotheses, ideally try to figure out which ones are the riskiest, and that's what we want to test so that we're being more mindful in spending our resources. That's what the essence of lean is all about is smart use of resources. It's not about being skimpy or cheap or cutting corners. It's about being very mindful of your resources. And the way I like to generalize it is you should invest your dev resources, which are usually a scarcest resource, in proportion to your level of confidence that you've got, right? And that confidence comes from evidence that we've got from user testing, either qualitative or quantitative data that gives us evidence, that gives us confidence that should inform how we invest our resources, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes so much sense when you say it out loud and you just talk about the math of it. Like your assumptions are probably wrong. Mm-hmm. So, minimum viable product is one of these terms that is both overused and super ambiguous because no one seems to have a single definition. What's your definition of it?
Yeah, no, I think, and it's funny because, anytime you have, it's a buzzword, right? Anytime you have a big movement, and actually, it existed before Lean Startup, but it became much more popular with Lean Startup. But anytime you have one of these buzzwords, it's, potentially going to be interpreted differently and misunderstood by different people. And so MVP is the poster child for that. You can go online and you can find quotes that say, hey, a landing page is an MVP, and then I remember seeing this, and then all the comments, people are like flaming the person and saying, no way, are you crazy? It's not an MVP. And it's bad because a lot of companies, they're like, well, we actually believe in a minimum lovable product, MLP. We believe in minimum viable feature or minimum sellable product. So they're coming up with these alternatives to basically have it match what their expectations or definitions are. So I think it is one of these terms that's not well understood. For me, the crux of the difference of opinion, and I do this in my workshops, I'll be like, who thinks a landing page is a MVP? And like, a third to half of the room will raise their hands. I'm like, who's like, heck no, there's no way that's an MVP. And then the other balance of the room raises their hands. Is that the P is what trips people up, that product, the word product. And so the hardcore people are like, how can a landing page be a product? It's not a product. I could just put whatever up, whether or not I can build it. You know what I mean? And so basically the landing page people, they'll go, well, you're learning from it. You're getting some learning. You're testing your assumptions, your hypotheses. So that's valuable. So the way I get out of that trap is just elevate it up one level and call them all MVP tests, basically, right? So we call it a test. And so an MVP test is basically anything that you're learning about to, either validate or invalidate one of your hypotheses, right? And then an MVP, without the word test, we can reserve for the things that are kind of prototypes of your product. They're actually testing the product experience and the product concept. So that would be things like, obviously, live product is a true MVP. Interactive prototypes are true MVP. Wizard of Oz, concierge type MVPs. That's what I reserve for true MVPs, where you're actually testing the hypotheses about the actual product concept itself. So both are useful, but they each have their different role. And in the book, I have a framework dividing up the true MVP versus the MVP test, and like product versus marketing, and quant and qual, basically, as a way to divide all the different ways you can test your hypotheses up.
Yeah, it's a good point you make about people getting stuck on the P. Like when we talk to clients, they're always wary to make it too small, and it's got to provide enough value and all these other things. And there's that quote by Reid Hoffman, who founded LinkedIn, of, if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you've launched too late. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's a good quote. I think people use it, like a lot of quotes, people use it for their own agenda, right? Or to further their own devices, right? I think the intent of it was, and some people take it literally, the intent of it was, at the time and still today, people have this idea, kind of a waterfall mindset, like, well, I've got to get this thing perfect before I launch. And the more I work on it, the more features I add, the better it's going to be. So that's kind of the mindset, right? And I've been there. I mean, I've been in that boat. Every time you launch a product, that's one of the toughest decisions to make is it good enough or not? And we can break that down according to my product market fit pyramid. We can start out with the simplest thing of functionality. Does it have the right set of functionality? Is it missing some key piece of functionality? That's the top debate that people just get wrapped around. And, someone's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're launching without feature X. And so then what happens? You put feature X in, and then someone else, some key stakeholder, key customer says, oh, I can't believe we won't have feature Y. And usually what happens is not actually the end customer. It's people within the company who are worried about the end customer and trying to act on their behalf. And you just get the slippery slope where the next thing you know, it's like the kitchen sink and it's no longer an MVP and your time to market has been pushed out, right? So this is one of the toughest decisions that teams need to make, is what really needs to be in that MVP. So I take his quote as antidote to the bias of people to try to make their MVP too perfect. So that's why he said it the way that he said. And it is one of the toughest judgments out there in the product world.
Yeah, perfection is the enemy of learning, really.
Yeah.
If you wait to get the perfect product out, you have no opportunity to learn. And the longer you go between actual learnings, right?
Yeah. And I've actually been there. So like early, when I was at Intuit, we were, working on connected software, and we would write, I walked into a product management machine and we would write these thick MRDs, like market requirement documents, right? As a young, eager beaver PM, you'd spend all this time trying to write it up. And what about this? What about this? And at the end of the day, a lot of people don't read that thing. And the idea is, I think the analogy I think of is like an archery bullseye, like a target, right? And the metaphor is, well, if I just spend a little more time and think about it some more and write it up more, I'll get closer and closer to that bullseye. And the reality is, you don't even know you don't know yet, right? So it's an illusion that if you just spend more time and getting it closer to perfect, I don't think anybody can launch a perfect product, because there's no way to know all the things you don't know until you get it in market. So these techniques of testing before you build are not to get it perfect. It's just to eliminate the big obvious risks and uncertainties to get it closer to the proverbial, bullseye, but you don't even know. It's kind of like the Matrix. Like there is no spoons, like there's no target. You don't even know what you're shooting for. You may have your target customer wrong, right? There's so many things you can be off until you get it in market. You don't really know.
Right. I struggle with MVP a little bit when we haven't first defined the minimum viable audience.
Right.
Like I think you have to start with your MVA before you can come up with a good MVP for that MVA, or otherwise you're building for who, right?
No, totally. And that's why the foundation of the product market fit pyramid is target customer, right? You got to define who is this for. And sometimes in my workshops, once in a while, someone will be like, why don't we just start with customer needs and problems, which is the second layer? I'm like, well, just solving this problem in a vacuum doesn't make as much sense as each target segment is going to have distinct needs and distinct preferences. And so I agree with you. You should be rooted in a distinct target customer audience and even MVP, right? So you've got several steps to go through. First step, who's my target customer audience? Second step, what do I think their needs are? And then a pass on what do I think the underserved needs are? Which ones are undermet, under-delivered on? Then you get up to a value proposition, which is how are we going to meet those needs in a way that's better or different than the competition? And then you get to feature set. And that's where MVP comes in. MVP is saying, okay, given all that pre-work and hypotheses, what's the feature set or functionality that we need? So I agree that you should have a handle on all three of those things, like who your target customer audience is, what are the underserved needs that you're going to deliver, and how you're going to meet those needs in a way that's better than the competition.
Right. And then once you achieve that product market fit with that minimum viable audience, you can then decide, do I continue to expand on the feature set or do I go for a larger audience?
Yeah, that's right. The other quote I love all the time is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, or don't let the great be the enemy of the good. I use it all the time, with people, because when I see product teams trying to perfect their product and they've gone past the point in my mind that's optimal. Yeah. And then once you've launched, then you can say, all right, cool. You're going to find stuff you didn't know. The question is just how many issues and what's the magnitude of those issues. Once you work those through, you can say, should we add additional value and functionality for this segment, or should we identify an adjacent segment that we can grow into? Definitely.
So do you think it's possible to launch an MVP for multiple personas or multiple audiences at once, or do you recommend just kind of going at one, picking one to hone in on?
Well, it's tough. I think that personas are a great way to get clarity on who our target customer is and get alignment on the team. And again, especially your V1 persona, it's just a set of assumptions or hypotheses, right? And you need to think about the market opportunity you're going after, and there may be multiple personas, right? So for example, like let's take Uber or Lyft. You've got riders and you've got drivers. So it's like at the end of the day, you're going to have to create enough value for both, because if you create this awesome app for drivers, but there's no riders, it's not going to work, and vice versa, right? I love to rank order prioritizing things. I call it ruthless prioritization. So I'm always happy to say who is the number one that we need to do. And I think too many times people have too many personas. Sometimes I go into a client and like, yep, our UX team or our marketing team create personas. Here's our 10 personas, and then it's like, okay, that's great, but which one are we really focusing on? And a lot of time there's not the rigor of thought, which is, do we look across the 10 to find out what's common across them and what's distinct across them? And what's the relative importance of each of these segments to our business? And if you do that, you can help prioritize. So, in the case of Uber, perhaps if I had to, I would do drivers first, right? Because you kind of need to do that. But then I would quickly follow with, what are we doing for riders? Or, it'd be easy to cop out and say, let's do both in parallel, right? But at the end of the day, again, I like to have a ruthless number one. Or Airbnb with guests and hosts, same kind of thing. In more of a B2B context, you have the end user, and then you have the economic buyer, usually as two distinct personas. Sometimes you might also have an admin use case, right? Again, there is not always the right answer, but I would generally try to start with the end user, make sure we're meeting their needs. And then also, unless the buyer was incredibly, was the dominating persona, that you could focus on the buyer needs. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to get the end user experience right. Even if you get them to purchase it, to get them to renew, you got to get the end user experience right. So I do like to focus on one. It's okay to have an opinion about what the other ones might be. But I do like to focus on one at the beginning if you can.
Got it. And I think, the traditional thought about MVP is, just going back years and years is, just get it out there. Don't worry about how it looks. Just make it work, just make it work. And you've got another pyramid that I think is great because it's just so simple. And people can just look at it and be like, are we doing this? An MVP's got to be a little bit functional, reliable, useful, and delightful.
Yeah. And that pyramid, I adapted from someone who adapted it from Aaron Walters. So Aaron Walters was the head of UX design for MailChimp. And I talk about this in the book. I remember the first time I used MailChimp, I actually just kind of smiled and maybe even laughed out loud because it was such a fun user experience. The tone was funny. The UX was great. The visual design was great. And they had a couple of delighter things in there you just didn't expect. So when I think of delight, I think of Aaron Walters and what he did with MailChimp. And so not surprisingly, he's the one that created this framework that the whole point of it, like you said, the bottom of the pyramid is and I modified this. These are my words now. Functional at the bottom. Next layer up is reliable. Next layer up is useful or usable, I think is my word. And the next level up is delightful. And the whole point of, in my mind, my take on the whole point of this pyramid, one main point is to elevate the discussion because, there are still some people that aren't quite focused on usability, but for the most part, that ship left 15 years ago. Yeah. Everybody knows, even if you're a B2B product, it's got to be usable or it's not going to work out. The whole point of this framework, in my mind, was to elevate the discussion beyond that and talk about delight. So if usability answers the questions, can users use your product? Delight answers the questions. Do they want to use your product? How do they feel when they're using your product, right? And so that's one point of it. The other application of it was, as you said, Joe, was most people misuse MVP that don't understand it. And they say, okay, we're not going to launch all the functionality. I got that it needs to be a subset. But they launch and they only launch a set of functionality and they ignore reliability. They ignore usability. They ignore delight. They say, it's okay if it's buggy. It's an MVP. We'll fix that later. It's okay. We'll do the UX later. It's just an MVP. And then what happens when you test that, if all you've got is a subset of functionality that may or may not even be right, but poor UX, poor reliability, and no delight, there's no way that MVP is going to test well. So then you test it, and then it's going to bomb, crash and burn. And then those people, same people that misuse and didn't understand how to do an MVP, will turn around and say, see, this whole lean agile stuff, it's baloney, doesn't work. Let's go back to doing waterfall, right? That's what happens. So, and that general idea of like kind of blaming the process or the tool after kind of a suboptimal implementation or application of it happens a lot. Anyway, so basically, I'm not trying to say it's going to be perfect. And it's kind of in a way goes against that Reid Hoffman advice, right? So obviously, if we could not be completely embarrassed, right, that'd be great, right? Embarrassed is like, what does that mean? Embarrassed by missing functionality, embarrassed by bugs, embarrassed by poor UX, right? Embarrassed by lack of delight. It's okay to be embarrassed on some of that stuff, but we got to get enough of it right. I would argue before you build, right? Because otherwise, you're wasting those resources. So back to this idea of, people run into this trap of slippery slope of, customer X is going to complain if we don't put feature A in there. One of my favorite things to do, if we just say, okay, we're worried about that too, let's just put the feature in. You're not really testing anything. You're biting the bullet. You're writing the check either way, right?
Yep.
And so what I love to do, this is where especially low fidelity can come into play. Early in your process, you say, you know what? I kind of do a little Jedi magic. Sounds like you have a hypothesis that if the MVP doesn't include feature A, customer X will be really upset. Did I capture your hypothesis properly? And then it was like, then they kind of look at you like a Spock, like, sure, yeah, that's my hypothesis. Yeah, right. It's like, great. Like, how might we test that hypothesis? Because if we just put the feature in there, we're not testing the hypothesis, right? So the main way to test the hypothesis is actually to show them a wireframe or prototype without the feature and see if anybody cries uncle and says, what the heck's going on here, right? And people are surprised time and again that they don't even notice it. Because when you do an MVP, if there's extra features in there, customers don't go, hey, why'd you put this extra feature X in there? That doesn't make any sense. I would never use it. They don't bother. They don't care. It doesn't bother them. It's no skin off their back. They don't even comment on that. But if you're missing a key feature, they will certainly scream and say, hey, where's my Salesforce? I don't see Salesforce integration here. There's no way I could do this without Salesforce integration or whatever it is, right? So that's why I like to do it early in the process, even in wireframes. Wireframes are a great way to test just the absence of functionality. Did you get the right feature set? Did you get the right overall, kind of information architecture and UX design?
Cool. So you mentioned doing user testing, and we'll definitely talk about that. But I love asking guests about all these buzzwords like we talked about earlier. So product market fit.
Yes.
What does that mean to you? And how do you know like when you're approaching it or if you've met it and like do you pivot? What do you do?
Yeah. So that's another buzzword, right? It was actually coined by Mark Andreessen back in 2007 and then became popular with Lean Startup. And, I think unlike MVP, product market fit, people talk about it pretty simplistically. At least they used to. Before I wrote my book, that's part of why I wrote the book is like, they'd be like, oh, Box succeeded because they had product market fit. Oh, sadly, Startup X failed because they did not have product market fit. So they just talked about like this big true false condition of either you were gangbusters successful or you weren't. And that's not really that helpful of a definition. We already have a word called profitable. So this must mean something else besides profitable, right? So for me, the essence of what it means is that customers basically are agreeing that your product is providing more value to them than the other alternatives that are out there. That's the essence of product market fit. And that's why in the product market fit pyramid, I guide people through the hypotheses to try to ensure that's the case. And the way I think about it is there are 5 key hypotheses you need to get right enough in order to achieve product market fit. You need to get your target customer right enough. You need to get the underserved needs that they have right enough. You need to get your value prop, which is how are we going to meet those needs in a way that's better than the competition right enough. You need to get your feature set, which we've been talking about, right enough. And you need to get your UX design right enough. They don't have to be perfect. It's like a big 5-term multiplication or logic right? And if any one of those is off, it can get in the way of product market fit. And the core of product market fit, the next question is how do you know if you have it? Once you've launched your product, right? The way you know you have it, I like to describe as like, imagine we have the world's slickest marketing person or salesperson. So they create the world's best landing page that has 100% conversion, or the world's best salesperson that always has 100% win rate. So we're able to get people in our door. They get in the door, they kick the tires on our product, but then they realize it didn't meet our needs, right? They're not going to come back and use it again if it doesn't meet their needs in a way that delivers more value than other products. Conversely, if we have the world's worst salesperson or the worst world landing page, but somehow a customer gets in there, if they get in there and kick the tires and realize, wow, this thing actually is useful and valuable, they're probably going to come back and use it again. So that core essence of knowing you have product market fit is that repeat usage, right? That's the core essence of knowing you have product market fit, is that repeat usage. The people, they checked out your product, they tried it out, and then after using it, they came back and used it again and again and again because it's delivering value for them, basically. So once we launch, the way we can track that is through retention rate. Retention rate is a formal way to track that repeat usage over time. And so the question is, well, pre-launch, what can we do? And that's what these techniques are. They're fuzzier because we don't have thousands of data points and things like that. But we actually need that qualitative depth. And we need to get our fingers dirty and really talk to people to understand, to refine those hypotheses and revise them. And so the way that works is really more just you're doing wave after wave of user tests, getting user feedback, figuring out what's wrong, what hypotheses did we get wrong, what features are missing, what UX did we get wrong, what messaging or positioning did we get wrong, and iterating and trying a pattern match and addressing those, coming up with a new iteration of your product, doing it again. And the way pre-launch, is basically you get to a point where you no longer have any like major complaints about the prototype that you've got. And people start saying, wow, I could really see this is useful. When is this going to go live? I could really see using this. So it's not as black and white and as hard as like a retention number, but that's how you basically, you can see the progress as you do wave after wave pre-launch.
Makes sense, right? You're scratching the itch. If your product is solving the problem, they're going to come back and use it again. And then you're on the right path.
Right.
We call that one of our loyalty metrics, right? They're coming back, they're using it. That means they're somewhat loyal to the product.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So the tagline of your book, the subtitle is How to Innovate with Minimum Viable Products and Rapid Customer Feedback. I think we beat up the minimum viable product part of that. So let's talk about the rapid customer feedback part.
Right. Definitely.
And the innovation part. So how do you define an innovation?
Well, basically, I think an innovation would be like, hey, we think, I would call it like a product concept. Like we think, hey, if we came up with this value prop that is going to meet these underserved needs for this target customer, and we think this feature set described by words, right, is going to deliver that value prop. So then the last piece of it is, once we've got that all kind of figured out, our MVP hypothesis or candidate, the next thing then is we need to actually manifest it with a user experience, right? We need to do that anyway to build it. But as we've talked about, I'm a huge fan of using those prototypes that you have to do anyway, or using the mock-ups and designs that you have to do anyway to tell the front-end team what to build, to use those as a validation tool to go out and talk to customers. And so all it takes really is a high enough fidelity and a high enough interactivity prototype to use. So prototype is a very generic word. And it's funny because back to the submarine world, the first use of prototype was in the submarine world. So you can imagine when you build a submarine, if you get something wrong, it's really hard to change after the fact because it's literally welded metal, expensive components. So they actually would build a full-scale wooden prototype. They call it a prototype of basically the whole thing. And then, as you know, I think some of you were nuclear trained, they also have prototypes of submarines sitting parked at the dock so that you get to test drive the real thing. So a prototype is just, representation of the real thing that lets you, test it with customers. And you can do rough testing with wireframes, right? Wireframes are good to see, hey, is there a key functionality missing? Does the overall layout make sense? Does the navigation make sense? The information architecture make sense? And Balsamic's a great tool for that, where it's got built-in clickability or tappability. If you add a menu item, it has a place to say, if the user taps here, where's it going to go? And then the next level up, that's good for rough stuff. The next level up where you can really get a lot of great feedback and where I spend most of my time is in clickable or tappable mockups, basically. And so here, you have higher fidelity. A lot of times the wireframes are grayscale and they're rough and they don't have images. And that's on purpose, right? Because the other thing I talk about a lot is the iceberg of UX design. And everybody fixates on the visual design, right? So the number of times I've taken like high fidelity mockups to a key stakeholder, and like the first thing they say is, the team spent all this time fretting about target customer and needs and MVP feature set and value prop. And we show the stakeholder the mockups and they go, what's this color of green you used here? I don't really like that green, right? That's like, the least important thing at that point. So the wireframes tend to be grayscale, so you can just avoid that and kind of put horse blinders on that. But then you get to high fidelity. Your designer exports some high fidelity mockups from Sketch or Photoshop or Illustrator. And then the cool thing is, using a tool like InVision, you can create a good enough experience where you go and you create these rectangular hotspots so that when somebody clicks or taps there, it goes to the other screen. And you can't string together everything. It's obviously not a fully interactive product, but you can string together what we call the happy path. And so I love testing there because you learn so much. And you haven't done any coding. And in the book and in my talks, I talk about a case study where I did that. And we were able to pivot super quickly. We just tossed out the old design, started from scratch, and took everything we learned from the first round of tests. And we're able to iterate very quickly and significantly improve the product market fit. So that's the general technique that I like to use. Is you use those, you do one-on-one tests with customers. I like to do waves of 5 to 10. 8's usually a good number, but some people want more data points. And some people, at the end of the day, it's funny, I talk about Oprah versus Spock, where Oprah is the master of qualitative one-on-one interviews, and Spock is the master of logic and analysis, the quantitative. And some people have such a Spock bias that even 10 users, that's only 10 users, it's only 10 users. How do you know it's not statistically significant? They get tripped up on statistical significance. And what I love to tell them is well, if 9 out of 10 people couldn't figure out how to register, you don't say, let me get 10,000 more data points to make sure my chi-squared calculation works out. You probably have a problem, right? You probably have an issue.
Right.
You got to be kind of mindful of that. And there'll be time later. Once we launch, then we can get, hopefully we have hundreds or thousands of customers, and then we can look at larger sample sizes.
All right. So let me test my understanding of your answer to my questions there. So you'll know you have an innovation when your customers agree and that you're getting engagement. You're moving towards your ultimate goal of adoption and traction, right? So that's how you know you've got an innovation. And you got to innovate. And you've got to rapidly get customer feedback so you continue down that path towards more innovation. It all sounds a lot to me. It relates to the Steve Jobs quote that everybody overuses about my customers don't know what they want until I show it to them, right?
Right. Yeah.
You got to get something out there to test.
Right. Yeah.
And this plays really well with you've got a diagram out there about problem space versus solution space.
Right.
So I'd love to open it up to have you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, related to that, it's funny because there are Steve Jobs quotes out there, and people always say, well, Apple, they're notorious for not doing customer research. But if you look at some of the quotes he's gotten that I use in my talks in the book, they're very customer centric, and they're very, it's not technology looking for a problem, a solution looking for a problem. It's really yeah, of course we want to know what the latest technical capabilities are, but we have to figure out how those end up solving a problem for someone. The other thing that comes up that people use a lot is the Henry Ford quote. If I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse and not have ever envisioned a car.
I love that quote, but I have an insertion there. He didn't actually say that. And if you do the research on that quote, some clever consultant figured out that there's no evidence that he actually said it, but it's a great quote anyway.
Yeah. But the point is, people like to misuse that quote to say, well, why do we need to talk to customers? They are not going to invent a car for us. That's what people misuse that quote, in my opinion.
Right.
And I say, yeah, of course not, because they're not electrical engineers and mechanical engineers. They're not software programmers or designers. It's ludicrous to expect your customers to just tell you the next product to build, right? It doesn't make any sense.
If it were that easy, we'd all ask our customers what they wanted and we'd all be building the exact same thing.
Yeah, exactly, right? The whole trick is, your job is to figure out the answer to all those key questions of who's our customer, what are their underserved needs, how can we meet them in a way that's better, different, what functionality and UX design is going to take. Your job is to do that. And so you're making all these hypotheses and assumptions in the problem space, about needs and customers. But you can't test those. The way to test those with customers is to actually then you create a solution space artifact, ideally a prototype or a live product. And that's what you test with customers, basically. And then you get the learnings from that. And then what do? You have to go back and revise your problem space hypotheses and assumptions, and then iterate and create a new solution space artifact.
I love it.
Yeah, so it's like this dance. You're doing this dance. You're using these mock-ups and prototypes as a way to get feedback, but then you're going back and revising your mental model, basically, right? Again, they're not going to tell you how to improve the UX design. Oh, yeah, this flow is bad. Go do this. You're just going to see they're getting stuck at point X. And now it's up to you to figure out the best way to do that. So along those lines, the thing about the car and horse quote is a lot of times people say, well, we're doing disruptive innovation. Customers can't even have a point of view about this thing at all. And I'm like, that's baloney, right? It's baloney. So many people think they're doing disruptive innovation when they're really not. They think they are. They don't understand what disruptive innovation means, which basically means if you look at the importance and satisfaction framework that I have, whatever the high watermark is today for satisfaction, like whichever product is the best at meeting a certain need, right? Disruptive innovation means you basically recalibrate that scale. And what it used to be a 10 out of 10 on that scale is now like a 5 out of 10 on that scale or a 2 out of 10 on that scale. That's what true disruptive innovation means. When you achieve like order of magnitude levels of satisfaction that are higher than the current solutions provide to that need. Because the needs and the problem space don't change anywhere nearly as quickly as the solutions. Solution technology waves come and go relatively quickly. They can. The example I list in the book is taking the need that people like to listen to music on the go. That's a need that a lot of people have. They've had it for a long time. The first solution to that was probably like the portable FM transistor radio that was battery powered. And then we had Walkman, right? And then we had CD players, right? And then we had portable MP3 players. Then we had the iPhone or the iPod. Now we all just use our phones. So we've got 5 or 6 technology waves, but the fundamental problem didn't change at all. So the bottom line is you should be able to articulate how is your potentially disruptive innovation creating higher levels of satisfaction? What need is it doing a better job on? Everyone else is doing this in 10 seconds. And the new technology lets us do it in 3 seconds. Or for everybody else, the cost per unit is $200, but this is going to let us get a cost per unit of $40. So even if customers, can't envision what your disruptive product is going to be, you should be able to articulate what the customer value is going to be to them.
I want to pull on something that you said for the audience here, and that is the point of the product team is figuring this stuff out.
Mm-hmm.
It's the whole point of developing a custom software product in the first place.
That's right.
So that's powerful.
Yeah, and that's why the best products are created by the best teams. And what does that mean? It means not only the first thing everybody focuses on is individual skill level. Oh, they must have a great designer. They must have a great front end developer, front back front, right? That's part of it, but you don't need the best. What's really important is how are they collaborating throughout the whole journey? Because it all starts with discovery at the beginning, right?
Customer empathy, right?
Yeah, and that's how you discover those unmet needs. You have hypotheses about unmet needs. And then you go and you test and validate or invalidate them. And it's great, specifically problem space, solution space, the designer's job is like, they should be involved in that so they know, but then their job is to help explore the solution space. I think that's another thing enough teams know too, is assuming we wave a magic wand and say, you have a really, really, really good understanding of your customer and the problems and the value prop. That's all problem space. The next important phase is great. Now, what is the best solution to meet that? And if all you do is come up with one mock-up and pursue that, then you haven't really explored the solution space at all. And obviously going from 0 to 1 mock-ups is great because 0 mock-ups get you nowhere. But what happens is people don't do deliberate divergent thinking. And at the end of the day, talented designers and design teams, that's their main value add is, okay, given that we have a clear understanding of the problem, let's explore the solution space. We could go with this kind of a mental model for the UI. We could do it this way. We could have a menu. We could have a drop down. All those different ways of doing it. There's value in solution exploration, and then obviously it's required. You want to have talented people developing it as well. So again, like teams that excel at that journey of getting clear about our hypotheses and how do we test them, and explore the problem space, explore the solution space, explore the tech solution space as well. Okay, given this design, what are the ways we can implement it now with technology? Should we use this framework or that framework, or which backend database should we use? So I think good teams, it's less about, obviously they need to have a certain level of skill, but it's really about how much shared vision and collaboration they have throughout that journey to build a product.
Makes a ton of sense. Well, we're coming up on time, so let me ask a question I think might be fitting for us to close with just before our last standard question we ask. We've talked about MVPs and what do you build, what don't you build, how far do you go, who do you do it with? Can you just talk a little bit about the value of saying no as a product manager?
Yes, definitely. It's really important. And the funny thing is, I like the joke about the product manager's motto and how it's like Spider-Man's motto. So Spider-Man's motto, a lot of Marvel fans know, is like, with great power comes great responsibility. So I like to jokingly say the PM motto is similar but different, which is with great responsibility comes no power. So the funny thing is, a lot of times no may seem a little harsh for a lot of product managers. So just to be clear, even if you don't say no, it's like, hey, no, not now. Not now is a knife usable, because the reality is the life of a product manager, even outside of just defining what the feature set should be, is there's way more ideas and things that could be done than you have bandwidth to do. That's true with your engineering team, right? You only have so many full-time dev equivalents. And the same thing with just your time, right? That's just the reality of it. So by definition, there's more ideas. So it's not saying no forever. It's just saying not now, not for this MVP, not for V1.1, not for this time frame, right? But it's really important because if you don't say now, and I work with a lot of teams where they don't, right? My favorite definition of strategy is it means saying no. And there's another Steve Jobs quote where he's talking about innovation, and he says innovation means saying no to 1,000 things. He's like, people think focusing means focusing on the thing that you're working on, but focus actually means saying no to all the other things. And he says all those thousands of other good ideas. So he's not throwing them under the bus and saying they're bad ideas. He's acknowledging that those other ideas are good. And so I like to, take his quote and just say strategy means saying no. If you think about the counterexample, not to pick on our prize sales friends, but they have a quota, they have an incentive, right? So if they're out talking to a prospective client and the client goes, well, is your new product going to have feature A? What does the salesperson say? They say, yeah, oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, just sign that $3 million contract. Oh yeah, we'll definitely have feature A. They come back to HQ. Hey guys, I signed a $3 million contract. We got to put feature A in there. You got to do it. Then the next salesperson goes to customer B, right? And customer B goes, well, is it going to have feature X in there? What do you think they say? They say yes to everything because that's their incentive, right? So saying yes to everything is the opposite of being strategic, right? The definition of being strategic means it's a choice that's not easily reversed. Because if you can just change your mind the next day, then it wasn't really strategic. It was just a decision. It wasn't a strategic decision, right? And so back to saying no, again, to tie it back to something we said, MVP is the toughest part to say no. It's one of the toughest spots to say no, right? Or not now, not for the MVP. I'm not saying we're never going to build it, but it shouldn't be in the MVP. And again, you can use a hack where it's like, well, why don't we do a test of a wireframe or mock-up without it instead of just biting the bullet and building it? So I agree. Saying no is important, and it's tough. I mean, it's no to this target segment. We're going to test this one first. This is the highest one first. It's no to, well, are we going to include this other set of needs in our value prop? Right? Not now, not for V1. And it's no to the feature set.
Love that. The more you've defined who it is you are actually serving with your product, the more you've defined who you aren't serving.
Right.
And the more clear you are about that, the more focused you can be on what problems you are solving and what problems you aren't solving. And that's how you really can focus on building a powerful product that will be a true innovation in your market space. That's good. Good answer. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think the trick is, are you building the mental model internally to know when to say no and when to say yes, right? It's not about arbitrarily saying no or yes or just kind of using your gut. It's like, can I explain why I'm saying yes to these 3 features for MVP and why I'm saying no to these 3 features for MVP? That's the key, I think, is building that mental model based on the evidence and testing your hypotheses over time.
All right, very good. Well, we have one question we ask all of our guests, and that's, what book are you reading now that you've read recently that you would recommend to our product audience, people that are passionate about software products? Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Well, I have several. I'm going to not say no. I'm going to have a big MVP. If people are intrigued by the ideas I've talked about, I would definitely recommend my book because it goes deeper into that.
Of course.
The book, specifically to answer your question, the book that I most recently read that I would recommend to other people is Jake Knapp's book, Make Time. It doesn't have anything to do with what we talked about today, but it's just a great productivity book. The audio book is especially engaging. Jake and his author, Jay-Z, read it. It's only 5 hours long, but I thought I was a pretty productive person, but they definitely gave me a lot of tips to be even more productive. And then 2 books I'll recommend related to the topic we talked about today. I'm a big fan of Laura Klein and her work. She's actually written several books. Her first book, UX for Lean Startups, is a really good book on this front. And then Steve Portugal has a book called Interviewing Users. He's a user researcher that thinks a lot and has a lot of advice on the user interviewing front, which we didn't even get to. We didn't even get to how to conduct great interviews. So definitely check out his stuff.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dan. This was amazing. I got a lot out of it. Is there anything else you wanted to plug?
I have a website. It's my name, Dan-Olsen, OLSEN.com. I post all of my talks up there. I don't blog a lot, but occasionally I will. What I do is every year I do a roundup of the top product conferences. So if you want to see the lay of the land for product conferences and find one to go to, they're up there. My speaking schedule's up there. And then for people in the Bay Area, or if you're visiting the SF Bay Area, I mentioned that monthly product speaker series that I run called Lean Product. You can go to meetup.com/lean-product. You can join the group for free, and that way you'll get notified when there's a new event.
All right.
That sounds great. I mean, I've been following Dan for a long time. I get a lot of value out of his content, so definitely highly recommend checking him out. And I hope everyone enjoyed this.
Great. Thanks a lot. Sean Joe was great.
All right. Thanks, Dan. All right. So that's it for today. Thanks for listening. And we're not going to just talk the talk. We're going to walk the walk. So we would love if you go into your podcast products and leave us a review. Sean and I guarantee and are committed to reading absolutely every piece of feedback we get there. And not only that, but you're helping other listeners by getting that feedback in there. It helps us move up the search rankings so that other people can find the episodes. So thank you, everyone.